All right. Well, I'm not assuming we're going to have a lot of people on here live. I'm actually sort of making this recording just for the sake of having, and it'll obviously be online therefore going forward. And I'll share the links after the session. So if you're not present, no problem whatsoever. Coach Benson, very happy that you guys at some point in time or the other have taken an opportunity to watch this. I've taken, I think over the last year or so of the pandemic, I've really sort of taken inventory of where my knowledge and where the, I would say, the gaps in my knowledge have been. And I've spent a lot of time trying to like put together cohesive models of movement and think my way through the best ways for me to pass along information to give you the purpose. And really at the end of the day, the thing that I find myself being more and more sort of inclined towards is this idea that your workout is your ability to move, and your workout should not remove mobility and your ability to move. It should in fact increase your movability, and therefore over the course of doing workouts over the week, over a month, over a year, instead of becoming injured and in pain, the objective would be, can we slowly in parallel lines make ourselves move in the right direction versus the wrong direction? And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're doing high intensity work, due to sitting all day long and then ramping up our metabolisms in a fairly quick manner, not doing the right preparation work. As you can see in the bottom, I've got a little visual there. The idea is that you got to prepare to perform, and then you need to recover so you can do it all over again. So that's the whole major concept behind this. I'm going to walk through the philosophy. I've got 9 major points I'm going to cover off over the course of this seminar today. Anyway, so welcome aboard. I am live on Facebook as well. So if you guys, wherever you're watching, if you're not live on Facebook, I'm live on Facebook. If any questions come in through the Facebook link, that's where I will end up answering them. I'm also live on YouTube, depending on where you're watching. So no further ado. The point of your workout being a way to build resilience sort of starts off with this major concept of meeting people where they're at. So the reality is, no matter where you are on this continuum, anywhere from injured and having limited function, particularly to a specific joint or a particular muscle, if that might be the case, that we can then progress along that continuum. So no matter where you are, the objective of any training program, no matter what your skill is, no matter what your scope of practices, etc., you're going to meet people where they're currently at. And it's easier said than done, to be perfectly honest. So wherever you meet them, then what you apply next will depend on where your scope of practice is, where your skills are, what skills that you currently possess, and what the needs of the client are. So basically that starts with the idea that if you're not assessing, you're guessing. So in order to really understand where someone is, you need to do an immense amount of intake. You need to constantly be monitoring the situation and make the appropriate decisions based on where that client currently is in terms of their ability or capacity and things along the line. So this little diagram just decided to show again that there is a continuum from low function to high function, and then the things you apply, the techniques you apply, will depend on your scope of practice and your skills. So the move progression, right? In simple, basically long and the short of it is that we're going to move people from moving better through the concept of moving well and then moving athletically. And the training techniques, the movement techniques you apply will differ upon where they are on this progression. Now, the black arrows are designed to say, these aren't, so when I learned NASM textbook version of this, I was taught to start people off at the base, which is like stability, move people through muscle endurance, strength, and power. And there's nothing wrong with that type of continuum. It's a very good visual. But the reality is, what you had to do in order to be able to meet people where they're at. Like if I come at an athlete, and I've made this mistake, just to be clear, if I go to an athlete and say, hey, listen, we're going to do a whole bunch of range of motion exercises for the next 4 to 6 weeks while we set your body up with mobility and stability. Where in the reality is what they're looking for is athletic conditioning. And if they're looking for athletic conditioning and I meet them with a whole bunch of mobility techniques, no matter how great of a salesman I am, I'm likely to not mentally understand the psychology of the buyer. So it's important to realize that if you can somehow move the needles together in parallel, so that's what the parallel lines are for, versus trying to treat it like I'm going to make you mobile and stable, I'm going to give you mobility, then I'm going to give you some muscle endurance or what's, tissue density and durability, which could increase, could be hypertrophy size of the tendons, ligaments, muscles, etc. And then I'm going to load it up explosively and with velocity and complexity, etc., etc. So, or I can try and meet them where they're at, which means I'm going to run these lines in parallel. So we've got 9 concepts you're going to work through. The first one is basically the idea of your workout is your rehab or your workout is your mobility, etc. Comes back to one basic thing, okay? Good movement ability requires that you be working in a pain-free situation. So most people, as you're well aware, I kind of make fun of the PAR-Qs because the second or third question on the PAR-Q is about joint pain, which 90% of the clients I've ever worked with that are over the age of 30 have it. So therefore, it's a difficult place to start. But again, the concept of meeting people where they're at means that they are going to be in a position to do something. So whether or not I have to change range of motion, change the speed of movement, lateralize the movement, if it was a steel word from Charlie Weingroff, and just basically make a regression, a progression, or a shift, like change one parameter of the movement so that they can do it relatively successfully. That could be as simple as elevating the heels, for example, onto a 1-inch block so that they can all of a sudden ankle mobility, which is a restrictor to this person's squat, now is removed and therefore they're able to squat. So versus taking away the squat and say, oh my God, that's a mess, find a way to have them execute it well. So, and without pain. I mean, I say zero pain, but what I mean is that, the level of discomfort is minimal, and whatever level of discomfort there is, it is changing as a result of you controlling motion. It is changing as a result of any interventions or any exercise program that you've put together for them versus it getting worse. So therefore, the concept of dead zone comes in. So if we look at motor control, which is what the picture is, the visual is of, it's all the sensory and motor inputs and elements related to motor action. So it's all the sensory and motor inputs that are coming in from the movement patterns, the combination of how the brain interprets it, or how the muscles and joints interpret, how that information is signaled back to the brain, and then what the feedback loop is back into the muscle to create that motor output. So no matter what it is, it has to have a degree of control. And one of the key things to understanding whether or not you have the capacity or ability to create motor control comes down to a simple concept called a dead zone, which is better known as the active passive range difference. So in this particular graphic, you're going to see that there's an assisted range of motion, which is passive range of motion. And this is, call it a, messed up hamstring stretch that would break me in half. Or B, that person who now has to work really hard to achieve. So there's 2 things I really want you to take away from this picture. One is that if there is no active passive range difference, so if the person on the right can lift their leg up into a toe point, whatever the name of this particular movement's called in ballet or dance, and it's exactly the same as the passive range or the assisted range, there is no dead zone. And therefore, the motor program around that joint, the joint is not being interfered with by anything specifically related to a restriction coming out of the nervous system. So therefore, you have a better chance of being able to train that particular range of motion, that particular set of joints and movements without risk of injury and or deeper problems further down the path. But if there is a dead zone, okay, so if we look at things like, okay, so if there is no dead zone, for example, but yet there's still a range of motion restriction, then your focus is going to be on tissue extensibility. So if there's a range of motion requirement for squatting, lunging, pushing, pulling that this person does not have because they don't have enough range of motion in their active straight leg raise, which is what this sort of depicts, Therefore, then you need to work on soft tissue work. So this could be rolfing, could be foam rolling, could be any number of massage type techniques that might help increase tissue extensibility. Could even be hydration for that matter if we start getting into fascial concepts. Joint stability, there is a dead zone, okay? So the difference between right and left. So the person on the left who's lifting her own leg can't get it up as high as the person on the left who's being assisted. So the result there means that the nervous system can't communicate to that joint effectively, and therefore techniques need to be worked on. That's often stabilization requirement, meaning if I put the body into a nice stacked alignment of the joints, they're likely to be able to achieve better range of motion because stability has been added into the pelvis, for example. So one of the simple ways to do that is to fire the core compression around the pelvis, which is in another picture coming up in a little bit, and then seeing if the range of motion increases because they have stability around that joint. Motor control, there's no dead zone, but the movement's compromised, which means that their ability to be able to use their active straight leg raise, so it could be a lunge, it could be a squat, the ability to use that joint through its range of motion is not consistent. That's a motor program problem, which means that someone's nervous system just hasn't been trained to do the pattern well, and or they're just not using the appropriate amount of internal and external feedback to achieve the range of motion as it is being described to them, the movement pattern, the way that you want it executed, which is not uncommon in sports, for example, which sometimes have very complex movement patterns. Anyway, that was long. So point 2, ability drives resilience, and resilience drives capacity. Lack of ability equals altered biomechanics. So if someone's not able to create mobility and stability, right, or tissue extensibility and stability around the joint, and or they don't have the right motor program, which means they haven't done the movement pattern enough to have appropriate alignment and structure and coordination to create consistent repetitions, then the result is often altered biomechanics no matter how we break it down. Now, so until we can get the tissue extensibility that we require, the joint stability that is necessary, and the motor programming around the movement pattern, it's important that we focus on enhancing those abilities before trying to layer in capacity. And that concept then is resilience, right? Can we consistently create a pattern through its full range of motion over relatively stacked joints and structure as required to be successful, whatever that deeming is, because that can vary very much depending on what the demands of the environment are and the demands and needs of the person are. So therefore, ability should trump capacity early on in the training program while still running the parallel line to some degree. At the same time, understanding that once abilities are laid down well, we should be able to build capacity over top of them. Again, thinking about meeting people where they're at. Now, if you're not assessing, you're guessing. So this is a client that I worked with on Saturday, this past Saturday, and this is a new application we have. It's called Wrkout. And we're able to screenshot, and you can see I didn't draw any lines on this particular picture, but I'm able to, in real time, through this app and personal training app, to actual dry lines on here and give the client instant feedback. Also, when I screenshot, for example, the client can see the screenshot on her screen as well. So I was able to like talk her through, look, can you see this? Can you see that? So instead of drawing lines for her, some of these patterns are pretty obvious. Now, she had a right hip issue, for example. So she tweaked something in her adductor magnus or high inner thigh, if you want, while squatting. And she happened to do that near me one day, so I offered to help her out along the way. So the thing is, why do we assess? Well, we assess for a number of reasons, because I want people to both be able to safely and effectively achieve their fitness and performance goals, lifestyle fitness performance goals. So if I don't do the assessment, I'm not sure how to meet her where she's at, first of all. Second of all, if it's performance related, the assessment might be specifically around the performance, the type of activity that she or he is performing in order to be able to achieve a desired outcome on a repeated basis, making sure that we're not inching them closer towards pain-free movement patterns and regeneration versus degeneration, and therefore de-evolving the movement pattern and the possibility of increasing risk of injury over time. So assess what they want as well. So we have two different types of assessment. I have a movement assessment, in this case because she's injured. So we're looking at biomechanics and how to like fix her and restructure her program, and then look at what movement compensation she may have had, what altered biomechanics might have been driving the issue, which we see here, for example, is that she's still slightly in hip flexion on that right hip, and she has a clear rotation. So that left hip is rotated down towards me, which could be a number of things. It could be something over in the right hip. Could also be something in that core diagonal core pattern from the right shoulder to the left hip. There's a lot of things, and that's why you have to go deeper and dig deeper into this. But first, you take a look at integrated training, integrated patterns, and then you start to dive a little bit deeper into the program. And functional movement systems does a great job of tiering people through knowledge in this particular capacity. So you go from FMS certification all the way to SFMA, for example. I have my own system, but that's besides the point. Now, secondarily to that, you have to assess what they want. So, for example, if this client, who used to be an ex-ballet dancer, also wants to be able to continue to move and dance as an adult recreational dancer, or additionally wants to be able to do other things like lose weight or increase squat strength, which in her case is true. She wants to increase her squat strength. The result of all that situation is that when she's unable to do that and I don't meet her where she's at, the outcome isn't desirable for her. So we got to start taking a look at these type of things. So then I look at other things. I go, well, okay, I'm going to look at something in the transverse plane too. So we look at a mobility drill in the transverse plane. And in this case, when I look at this particular spinal rotation assessment, for example, if it's a driver, I need to come back to this test over and over and over. So finding the movement driver isn't as simple as finding a result on assessment. I could find a result on 5 different assessments, and only one of those assessments was actually the key one to me helping. So in this case, for example, the spinal rotation isn't the driver. And there's a deeper story here related to this person's posture, et cetera, but when I look at the way she rotated, there's more to it than just having restricted range of motion. So if her right shoulder was farther off the ground than her left, that means she had restricted thoracic mobility, or predominantly thoracic mobility, which is what this test predominantly looks at. But I look at the arch in her back. So when I look at the way she's moving around this pattern, those lines that are around her thorax and the lumbothoracic joint, and then the arch or the lateral flexion in her spine on that bottom hip is different on that side than it was on the other side. So therefore, the corrective exercise I gave her was designed to help her right spinal rotation and change some of the things that also I noticed in the lower quadrant associated with other assessments. So I started to integrate some of the assessment information. There's a simple rule. It's called do more what it likes and less of what it dislikes. So if this thing, which is called reach and rotate, does not help the spinal rotation, I know that I'm not using the right corrective movement to change the outcome of thoracic rotation, and therefore better mechanics around the lumbothoracic joint. Therefore, move along. That's not the right corrective exercise, or she's not doing it the right way, which in a virtual world is a whole different set of beasts, where you got to make sure that the clients are actually executing the devil's in the details kind of concepts. But I need to test and retest. So she got in and out of this position numerous times to see if the exercise I'm asking for, which has certain drivers attached to it, actually helped improve spinal rotation. Not only did I want it to improve spinal rotation, I wanted it to improve her 1-foot bridge and her overhead squat. So if it's a really important driver, it will improve things at the thorax will actually improve things at the sacrum as well. And through the lumbopelvic concept, there's a number of different muscles that connect here. Now, all that's great. I get all this good information from a functional movement assessment, but I also need to realize that when I'm building the program, I need to meet them where they're at. So I need to build a program that's both based on the needs. So it's weighted sort of in my old school thinking, I would always weight the program toward their need. What does she need in order to safely execute squats, for example, which is an important goal of hers? Well, reality is that isn't what she wants to do. What she wants to do is be a little bit badass in the gym. She wants to be able to lift a decent amount of weight in the squat. So if I take all that away from her and say, hey, listen, we got to go back to really basic mechanical stuff, what she needs, I might lose her because what she wants to do, which is be a badass in the gym, isn't going to happen. Okay, so I've started to realize that more importantly is that it's not that the wants and needs need to be imbalanced. They need to be perfectly balanced. If you can balance where someone's wants are and what someone's needs are and move that parallel line, you're likely to build rapport. You're likely to build trust. You're likely to have a long relationship with that client. And the result then is that you'll get the outcome you want, which is needs based, but maybe over a slightly longer period of time. Maybe it's not going to happen overnight. Maybe it's going to take a little bit longer to achieve the same goal, which is totally fine. At the end of the day, that is absolutely okay. There's no issue with that whatsoever. I'm just standing up, moving back a little bit. So continuing down that sort of mindset and thinking process is that, well, if you look at this overhead squat, for example, there's no question in my mind that we have a lot of issues associated with this. Now, to give you some insight here, she has a scoliosis. She has an S-shaped scoliosis, okay, that C curves top and bottom. So bottom line of this is that squat is shifted to the right because I can see more of her left lateral thigh than I can the right side. I can see that her right sacrum is tilted up, okay? Her right sacrum is rotated forward, and that is more indicated by the ankle. If you look at the right ankle is in pronation, so the subtalar pronation of the right side. Both arms are bent excessively. I did a deeper dive into that with a different assessment. The right one looks more bent than the left in this case, but when I did a deeper dive, it's actually the left that's more bent than the right, and the left arm and right arm are far away from her head because the lats are just so tight in this particular case. So result of all of this is that there's a lot of stuff there to work on, and because of that shift to the right that creates a right rotation in the pelvis, it's going to create overuse of the adductor magnus, underuse of some of the gluteus muscles, probably the glute medius and glute external rotator portion of the foot. The foot mechanics are not lined up well, so I had to decide, is the ankle a driver or an outcome? A way to try and find range of motion into the squat because there's such a shift around the pelvis. Now, because there is a spinal issue, like a structural spinal issue, it could be either way, and or some combination of both. So you just got to keep looking, you got to keep diving, you got to keep looking for the drivers. But regardless, I have to find a way to help her achieve squatting in a way that's not going to cause her to further injure her adductor magnus or the adductors, particularly up around the sacrum and the pelvis in this case, and at the same time not put her at greater risk of injury, and then try to create some structure and alignment through any means possible to let her still continue down the path of doing what she wants while getting what she needs. And some of the things on the right-hand side, for example, are just examples of some corrective strategies you can use, right? So we can create some postural awareness by using a doweling rod, which is why that stick's sticking out of the top of my head. We can use assistance, which is what Brian's doing. So he's holding on to a TRX similar to like if I grab a TRX overhead right now. If I grab a TRX, it unweights my body. If I grab cable, it unweights my body. So the result of unweighting my body is that I don't have as much stability requirement up and down the kinetic chain. And it can also alter my mechanics where I don't need as much dorsiflexion. So I could do things like raise my heels. And these are all lateralizations while still getting postural feedback and structure. There's other ways then to load one leg at a time. So in this case, I would have to make decisions about, is it the left or right hip? Is it the right hip that's tight? Or is the left hip unstable, or is it tight? And is that why she's shifting over to the right-hand side? Because she's looking for better range, because she has better range of motion ability on the right-hand side? Or is it just structural, because that's the way her spine wants to drive her body? All of these things are entirely possible. And again, if you start looking a bit deeper onto this, you start understanding that the reason why, for example, like a thoracic rotation assessment, the spinal rotation assessment, might be an important step in the chain of piecing this puzzle back together, is that there are direct connections from the thorax down into the sacrum, and the tension in that tissue or the tightness in that tissue and the posture that's above and below that tissue can directly impact how one joint affects another one further up the kinetic chain. And therefore, some of these assessments, for example, I've seen it many times over, where improving the spinal rotation assessment directly increases, and these are people that have rotational pattern issues and transverse plane rotation issues, directly impact the straight leg raise test. So never assume anything until you've done the assessments, you've added a corrective exercise in there. The corrective exercise changes things up and down the kinetic chain so that both functional movement patterns and the particular assessment have improved significantly. And if that's the case, then you likely found the driver. There's a few other nuances, but that's a simple way to do it. You constantly need to check and recheck, and you have to do it in a kind of a smooth, seamless way, especially if you're in a workout. If you're a therapist, then obviously that's your entire job. If you're doing just assessment work, that's your entire job. But if you're trying to integrate assessment results into a training program, you need to try and smoothly move in and out of test, retest, exercise, test, retest, and just sort of jump back and forth. And then when you do make connection to the driver, continue to layer information into the training program, part of the warm up, part of the cool down, etc., to help improve the biomechanics over time. So point number 7, once you've established good movement patterning, once you've established the ability to be able to, the abilities necessary to create fundamental movements through a full range of motion, we can start then adding in progressive overload principles. So we can start adding load, so the amount of weight that's being lifted. We can start adding velocity and how fast we're moving in and out of the movement pattern. We can add complexity, having, obviously, in this case, obviously a bull, a cow, a calf turning into a cow, turning into a bull. And I don't know what the transition was, but I probably screwed that up. The point is, that's a unilateral, off-sided, very complex load. So the complexity of lifting a cow onto your shoulder is fairly difficult. And then if you're trying to, these kind of offload carries are very difficult compared to, say, just putting a bilateral pattern of a bar on your back. Volume and fatigue. So you start off with relatively low volume of work and you keep building up the tissue motor capacity tolerance, meaning like I can do the repetition, I can do the first 5 and I can do them really well. And then because of fatigue, because of lack of muscle endurance, because of proprioception weakness, because of training history with good movement programming, the mechanics start to break down. And once the mechanics start breaking down, you need to stop. So training volume can increase over time, and it's all based on how well they're moving. And take things like this, right? So for example, we start talking about progressive overload. Point 7 is now we take relatively basic patterns like a deadlift, right, where we have everything centered down the middle of the body, picking something up, putting something down in a very consistent pattern. Set it up, create the right set of progressions in order to make sure that they have all of the abilities that are necessary. Start loading capacities, progressively overloading to capacities, as you can see that the deadlift was doing on the left. And then we move over to dead shifting, where we start taking these loads off center. So the Viper Pro is one of my favorite tools for doing anything off center, because there's a zillion different grips on this. There's this grip, there's the neutral basic grip. I can flip this thing around, and then I got mid grips. I can take this as one grip at a time. I mean, everyone's seen the Thor lift. I mean, it was on post on my Instagram, but like I can go all kinds of different patterns. Then I can get all the way down to lifting with a very short lever. I could even go shorter than that if I wanted to. So, I mean, this is easy. I can lift this from the ground relatively easily, even though it's a vector challenge. But if I start going here, this is start to get really vector challenge, and I can start going off to the side too, so my vectors can actually change directions, which changes the load pattern. So we talk about deadlifting, and it's meant to be designed to increase load because the amount of degrees of variance are low. But as we start to increase the degree of variance, the lever lengths, et cetera, and start changing vectors and start adding in reactivity, which means that someone, for example, I could be lifting that and someone actually put a torque on the end of the log, the Viper, in such a way that it creates a heavy reactive demand on my body, where my nervous system has to react to the load at a given moment. So, point is, progressive overload then moves to progressively overloading movement and vector variability, as well as the speed and the range of motion and all the other requirements that are necessary to create great ability. This is when we start really challenging capacity. And then beyond that, the last but not least vector is, okay, well then these are great. It means I'm teaching my body to be able to respond in all these different ways, but it's still specific to exercises or movement. But what if the exercise or movement is a sport? Okay, so one of my good friends, Scott Livingston, and his wife Jamie have put together a great course through reconditioninghq.com, which looks at and his enormous background with Olympic athletes in high performance sport for better part of 20, 25 years now, including with the NHL, and vastly involved with Olympians for the last 15 years or so, allows him now to sort of take that concept of, well, we need to also profile movement specific to the demands of the sport. So in this case, for example, I just pulled this picture from someone off the internet who had done a great job. They looked at, okay, well, what are the requirements? What are the movement requirements of a good forward skating stride? What are the movement requirements and mechanical requirements of a forward crossover stride? So hockey obviously being near and dear to my own heart because of my own personal background, as well as just sort of an easy way to sort of isolate this, is that someone like Scott and someone who specializes in movement specificity and the reconditioning of movement from low function all the way up to high function, and therefore creating that durability and that resilience in high performance sport that's required, because the number one reason why people lose gold medals and performance decrements occur even in team sports is lost training days, right? So the number of lost training days directly impacts your ability to be able to train consistently and at a high level, and consistent high level training and performance is what tends to achieve greatness. So anyway, to this point, the last thing you need to understand is that these vectors then can specific. So now I can turn the Viper into, for example, overloading a slap shot type pattern, or learning how to decelerate a position, or getting myself into these odd positions that might look like a body contact against the boards, where I can learn how to like create strength in that moment to be able to fend someone off a puck, warding someone off, being able to hold position, being able to like going inside here and staying strong on that inside shoulder, and not losing this battle against the guy who's trying to check the player coming on offense right now. So get the idea. A lot of different things to consider. The point is, you always need to meet people where they're at. You need to understand that if we do it well, their workout is their movability. The workout should always inch them towards their goals safely and effectively. It should always understand the basic principles of motor programming. It should understand the basic principles of tissue density, tissue structure, posture, alignment, mechanics associated with the movement pattern, because technique does matter, etc. So this was all I did was overview everything today. Is an overview of things that I want to actually program. So for example, this is a 3-part series. So in this 3-part series, next week, I'm going to actually go right back to the very first slide, and we're going to look at dead zone training. So we're going to look at how to, and this will be more of a workshop, less of a PowerPoint, more of a workshop. And the reality is then I'm going to show you, okay, so when there is a active passive range difference. So when this is my active arm raise, flexion, shoulder flexion, and that's my passive shoulder flexion range of motion. This is my passive, right? If I have passive range of motion, straight leg raise, and this is my active straight leg, and there's a difference, and or if there isn't a difference, but there's a restriction, and how to go through that decision matrix of when to make the right changes and test retest. So at the end of the day, adding a stability exercise in, did it improve the assessment result? So that's what next week's going to be all about, taking a couple of assessments, doing a deep dive into finding drivers and knowing when you've found a driver, and what the basic tenets of making the right decision in order to be able to remove the dead zone. And that technique commonly used by myself is called the active, passive, active training technique. So use active range of motion, passive assistance, active holds at end range of motion to remove that dead zone. And if the changes aren't made, change the technique, reevaluate, make another decision, try a different pathway to find the right driver. Anyway, there you go. A little Monday shot of information for you. I hope it gave you some thoughts. It created a system of thinking around how to take movement from low function to high function, and understanding that in the next 2 weeks, we're actually going to take a deeper dive into first achieving range of motion and function around a joint, to then finally loading function around that joint in reactive vector variable kind of way. So 3 weeks, 3 seminars, first one's done. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Get outside. It's beautiful and sunny here on the West Coast, wherever you're watching from. I thank you very much. And again, if there's any questions in the Facebook chat whatsoever, I will deal with them.